the Big Bang is what we're taught on an academic level as to the beginnings of the universe. We could debate the Big Bang all day. We could say that the Big Bang is irrelevant to a talk about atheism. But as an atheist, in order to be convicted of your fact that a God does not exist, where does your conviction come from? It comes from an understanding of science, right? An understanding of the scientific method and the rules that define our universe. That said, at a certain point, you have to actually go by the science and understand when maybe, just maybe, this status quo being taught to you isn't actually a sufficient way to see it. So let's riddle us this. If you have an absolute conviction that God does not exist and you are an atheist, we have solved this definition. At what point does your conviction border on religion? Let's have an honest conversation about that first and foremost. Don't talk to me about straw men. Don't talk to me like I'm blowing hot smoke out of my ass. Let's all admit, the modern atheist believes in these things. Let's see.
Yo, how's it going?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I'm doing good, doing good. What should I call you? Feels a little weird to call you Afrologist.
Oh, you can just call me Afro. You can call me Vince. That's
okay. I'll call you Vince.
Yeah, because your whole name's on display, so you might as well.
Yeah. Well, it's my first and middle name at least. But yeah, good talking with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. So I think
I'm an atheist, by the way. I was enjoying talking with you about the Big Bang a little bit in the chat there. Just trying to readjust my screen. And Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, interested in all that stuff. But I was saying that basically, I think that you're going wrong by thinking that the singularity is a part of the modern Big Bang model in some sort of like physical sense. Like the singularity was like a thing that actually existed. And modern physicists do not believe that.
Yeah, because I mentioned that it's superpositional. Because if it is an entity, then you have to establish correct limits for it. Part of the interesting fact of the early universe is that you have to, like I've heard before from my physics professor, crack a few eggs to make an omelet. My rebuke of much of that mathematical construct, because again, it's built out of theorems. It's built mathematically. It's not something that we've observed directly through optics. We still, even with the James Webb, even with gravitational lensing, have still reached a limit to the universe. So everything past this visual limit is now guesswork.
I would agree with you that there is like a limit to our empirical data, like our ability to probe like beyond the CMB as being like the earliest photons that we can see. There's some potential for maybe there being a neutrino background or maybe a gravitational wave background, but that is like totally new frontier type stuff, not like cemented in known science. So I agree. There's a hard empirical limit of how far we can see. And I will say, though, with what you're describing about the Big Bang being like constructed mathematically, that just sounds like the scientific method, basically, right? You construct your hypothesis and then make a prediction that, hey, if the Big Bang model is true, then we should expect to see this, and then comparing that with actual empirical results. And so, in my opinion, the number one best empirical evidence for the Big Bang that I am not aware of any other potential explanation for is the power spectrum of the CMB. I know I've heard you say that the CMB you think is either influenced by the sun or generated by the sun. I don't know if you wanted to go into that a bit more, but I think that the specific property of the CMB, its temperature power spectrum itself, that is the best evidence for the Big Bang model, in my opinion.
Yeah. So with the CMB, the main rebuke I've had of it in the past, I only said it in passing because I've covered part of it before. So when the Voyager probe crossed the heliopause, it was big news. That's because we realized the actual magnetic properties of the sun's heliopause were nothing like what astrophysicists had predicted. There was turbulence to it. It proceeded in erratic factions. There were fractal elements to it. It was almost like a roiling bubble rather than this neat concentric rings of magnetic energy with perturbations. What we realized then is that the energetic state of interstellar space is not this perfect little vacuum with random perturbances here and there, but there's transitional properties between star systems, between different areas of our galaxy, and between different galaxies themselves. the processes by which galaxies merge. We know that a dwarf galaxy merged with our own just by observing deeper and with higher resolution into deeper space. And the CMB is something that was observed from low Earth orbit, looking up, trying to get above the accretion disk of the galaxy and trying to see a uniform variable in terms of energetic emission. This is where the background radiation comes in. We know it's a clear frequency above this energetic floor, and the rest of what we know is fairly neutral space-time. The issue with this is the same issue that you have when I'm trying to observe stellar objects from, let's say, sea level here in Hawaii, where I live. You have certain energetic interference. If we can't even properly understand the energetic properties and emissions of our own sun, what kind of influences does our own galaxy or the nearby Andromeda galaxy or the previously merged dwarf planet or entities surrounding our galaxy that we can't readily observe? How do all of these things affect background radiation? Is there some sort of background radiation cloud that exists within our local group or just surrounding our galaxy itself? If we don't even properly know how our galaxy was consolidated and stays in shape without dark energy and dark matter, without placeholders in the math, who's to say that this CMB is reliable whatsoever as to determine what exists in deep space or in deep time? That's all I had to say about CMB, because I'm just inherently skeptical when somebody points a telescope from, I mean, even within Earth's magnetic field and says there's background radiation. It's just like, that this needs to be explored more. And that's science, isn't it? I mean, this is what's lovely about science, is wanting to explore more to get better answers. And mostly of what I'm saying, dude, and this is the heart and bones of what I'm trying to say this whole time, bro, this is like what I paid to hear. I'm not talking about the Big Bang because I think this is exactly how it happened. I went to the University of Tübingen to do physics, but also San Francisco State University. And that was just how I was taught. And it's outdated. It's probably incorrect from your perspective because you're better acquainted with cosmology, but this is what I was taught at undergrad level physics 1 and 2. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that there is now, I believe, a fundamentally principled and organized, funded element to atheism, or something that even encompasses most of atheism now, that I think reflects religious principles, that reflects religious doctrine and structure. And that's sort of where I was going with that.
Okay, yeah. I guess the whole reason why we started arguing about the Big Bang in the first place was because, as I understood your claim that atheism is a religion, is that I understood your definition to religion to mean any kind of shared set of ideology or something, approaching dogma that is essentially explaining the origins of our universe. And you said basically you don't need a god to have a religion. I can agree with that. But as far as I understood, so then I was trying to explain that in the current consensus in cosmology, the Big Bang is not the beginning of the universe, because the Big Bang starts with the universe already existing, just in a smaller, hotter, denser state. But that's just the initial starting, because we don't have enough data to say anything before that, because literally, like you said with the singularity, the mathematics just start spitting out infinities. And when we look at other areas where we see other singularities in other fields of science, in areas where you would have no issues at all whatsoever, like I commonly point out in fluid dynamics, if you calculate like the curvature of like a water droplet, you'll get a singularity at the very tip. With the equations of fluid dynamics, it'll spit out I was going to share this, but yes, it'll spit out an infinity. So you'll have a singularity in a water droplet, but nobody thinks that there's an actual singularity that physically exists every time there's a water droplet in your faucet. You know what I'm saying? So that's what my point was about singularities. This is the temperature power spectrum of the CMB. You were kind of casting some shade, saying, you know, there's so much variables that could be influencing this background radiation. How do we know that it is what scientists are saying it is? This, to me, is the strongest evidence. What you're looking at here is, in this graph, the green shaded area is the prediction from the Big Bang model plus the dark energy, the dark matter observations. So each one of those parameters is coming from a different set of observations, like gravitational observations, whatever. They're getting about 6 parameters to calculate this green prediction. And those 6 parameters are observed from like looking at other independent areas of our universe. Then they calculate this prediction in this green area, and then the red with the error bars, which get really small there at the high angular scales, that's the actual observed results in the CMB, the cosmic microwave background. They're just looking at the way that those temperature fluctuations are distributed, and there's a precise pattern in that distribution. It's not like this is just totally random, this is just chaos and noise. It's this precise. You see the green and how perfectly that red observation matches those green predictions. And that's with dark energy, with dark matter, with inflationary Big Bang cosmology. That's what the model predicted. It's like these things are very precise. Like this can't be just a coincidence. This either has to be some sort of like scientific conspiracy or something, or it actually is that the CMB is what scientists think it is from the Big Bang.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have the tail wagging the dog if you don't have, I mean, the data for the Big Bang. I mean, you can have this graph and have it be in place, and yeah, the data matches up. It's great. It's awesome. The issue is, of course, is that with all science being observable, replicable, and testable, how can we test this graph's merits? We can say, okay, well, this justifies it. I know that in the beginning we have this massive margin of error at around 90 degrees, and we get a better convergence towards the end, towards the places where we know that based off of the actual properties, residences, relative mass, and the actual functioning operating of these particles, that this is how this would probably turn out if we look at the background radiation. The scalar issue that I have a lot of times with these outputs is that we had the same margin of error for data and understood these phenomena on the exact same mathematical parameters when it came to the heliopause of the sun, when it came to the other fundamental aspects of the universe and fundamental processes that we also thought, well, this matches so well with our data. We were so convinced, and it blew the whole bombshell off it because there's always something that we didn't account for. There's something that in the cosmos, there was just something else about it that leads to a difference of outcome. So this is a step in the right direction. I think this is actually a guide that maybe we've gone the right way initially, that the hound has caught the scent of something meaningful and that we're actually on the way to explaining something big. But the trap that we then fall into is then seeing the state and falling in love with it. Oh, it's so perfect, it's so nice. And yet how many times in science have we been shown that there is an incomplete picture here, that we've aligned ourselves with a certain part of the truth, but now we have to go beyond and actually be reasonable how we sleuth it out.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just think that
you're good.
At least, I don't know, maybe, I don't know if you just had a bad teacher or what, dude, but the way that I was taught about these things was not like, oh, we have the complete picture. Like in the way that I was taught, they talked about the limitations. We were taught about like the crises in cosmology, the things that don't add up, because that's where the progress in science is made, is by studying those incongruities. Like, yes, like quantum field theory makes the most precise predictions to date in terms of the margin of error. But we also know that it doesn't at all account for quantum gravity. So it cannot be the final answer. There has to be a more like fundamental theory out there that can describe all these things, right? Eventually. So like there might be a theory that supplants it one day. I think it's, at least when I was taught science, it usually was communicated to me as provisional. This knowledge is provisional. Our data and our theories are not complete. We're always trying to progress forward. The key idea is that as we get more and more data, our theories get more and more accurate in accordance with empirical reality, right? So, I mean, the current model of cosmology would be the best we've got with the current data that we've got right now. So let's collect more data and keep working towards a better one, right?
Yeah, I think that a lot of academia is sort of engineered around this, isn't it? I mean, a lot of the times you're still expected to give out results. It's not like STEM is a useless field by any means. Many of these things are directly applicable, and the progress being made in STEM is groundbreaking. I mean, we're getting farther now than I ever thought we would. Like seeing,
doesn't that make it
different? Apple commercializing a quantum computer chip now, like being able to actually do that reliably and commercially. Yeah, Microsoft. It's actually incredible. But
isn't that doesn't that make it unlike a religion though, to like wrap up like the scientific consensus about the Big Bang and abiogenesis and evolution and just scientific consensus in general to like wrap it up and say that it's akin to some sort of religious dogma for atheism, doesn't that seem like it's unlike religion in a lot of the ways that you just highlighted?
Okay, yes, because here's the thing. It's not just a matter of like, oh, well, you have a different way of viewing the Big Bang, or you have data and you're delineating this in a skeptical view. That's within the correct parameters of our Overton window. What I'm saying is, if you come up to them with a plasma cosmology model of the universe that you can also back up mathematically, one of the reasons that plasma cosmology is annoying is because they've taken advantage of this superpositional dead like pixel in our eye, mathematically speaking, when it comes to like how particles actually work. The particle wave question is something that they've kind of utilized and slipped into to create an alternate view of the universe. What I'm saying is, when you're paying for your degree and you get to the end, when you go and you have to defend a master's thesis or a doctor's dissertation, if you're just slightly stepping out of the bounds and pushing the envelope, that's what they want to see. That's exactly what they want to see. Somebody taking the data and using it in a way that is guided and directed in a result that has been constantly being chiseled away at by specialists for decades. This is where we've gotten to when it comes to like the field of artificial life, for example. You guys, Japanese guys making like clones out of synthetic muscle and stuff now, dangling from ceilings. Like it's getting crazy. But one thing you'll continuously see is that if you step too far outside of this window, the backlash you receive is horrific. Even if your math checks out, even if everything builds up perfectly methodologically, besides the premise, the very premise itself will have them make you go back to the drawing board.
That's disagree with that. I think that
I see it happen all the time, dude.
If you're I think that you're operating under a faulty premise. Like what I just heard with the way that you set up that question was taking it for granted that these people are doing this perfectly consistent mathematical model that perfectly matches with their observations of reality. That is not an assumption that I would grant for that, especially if you're bringing up plasma cosmology. Would you be quoting like Eric Lerner and like his research? I mean, no, his research does not align with your description there of being
he's a funny target. I bring him up on purpose.
I know, but I'm just saying
plasma cosmology because it's seen as a meme.
With exactly what we were just talking about with the temperature like power spectrum of the CMB. I mean, plasma cosmology has squat about that. What I would consider to be the strongest line of evidence pointing directly towards a Big Bang. Eric Lerner's model like just has no good explanation for it. It's just so kind of ad hoc explanation. So I mean, there's clearly a superior model in explaining our reality. Eric Lerner, basically, it's like a lie by omission, right? His publications don't deal with the problems that his model can't address. He tries to make it seem like in his publications, oh, my model can do everything, but then he just conveniently never talks about the limitations of his model. Like that's a big red flag for a scientific model. Like I'm over here readily admitting and agreeing with you about all of the limitations in modern cosmology. Like Eric Lerner would never about plasma cosmology's limits. You never see like him acknowledge any limits. It can do everything. It's just the way better. And why do all these scientists are against him and they're all turning against him? It's because like they can see what he's doing.
Yeah. And I bring him up facetiously because he's a good example of someone who it's easy to start picking apart methodology with the easiest people. It's like polyglots who clearly can't speak the languages. It's a similar variable. The only thing I'm saying is when you have a lot of funding in one direction and no funding anywhere else. Because one of the things I actually posed earlier is what other alternative explanations for, if it's not a beginning of the universe, at least a conditions of an early universe that you've heard of that aren't the Big Bang or plasma cosmology?
Like there's all like a cyclical universe of big bangs, big crunches. There's the idea of there being previous universes or like some sort of like even Darwinian-esque evolution of universes through some sort of budding or black hole related process. There's holographic ideas about the creation of the universe as being a black hole within a parent universe. There's a lot of different like things that I've heard, especially with the introductions of like maybe some non-metric time before inflation, all kinds of things relating to, especially since we don't even know fundamentally what space-time is, like how it is generated. if there's really space-time as a fundamental to reality or not, like a quantum space-time, quantum gravity, like there's huge missing chunks in our fundamental understanding of reality in modern physics. So like there's a bunch of areas where I would just concede like we don't have enough data to like make any sort of definitive stance. So like we have to just admit our epistemological limits and say the most honest intellectual position is just to say we don't know yet.
Yeah. And I think that's sensible. I think very similarly to the delineation between the average politician, the average citizen of their country, I think you do see sensible, genuinely good ideas and a plethora of good optimism and enthusiasm from young scientists and young intellectuals. But what I also see at the same time is a concrete and established hierarchy to this organization of science. As any adjunct will tell you, this ladder is long and it's covered in bird shit. It's very tough to get anywhere in academia without kissing ass and brown nosing. And what you'll find at the top is a lot of ego. And when I look at a religion, and going back to this, all of these great merits of science, honestly, dude, science should stay objective. Science should stay purely objective. I'm firmly of the opinion that science needs to stay close to its roots, understand how we got here, and move on in a progressive way that's objective. And the only thing that sticks in my craw a little bit is that actual free thought, actual critical thought is actually not really being taught to us. These are things we have to gain through experience, through exposure, through deeper understanding of the data. And you say that maybe I've had bad teachers, and maybe I have. But I've also gone to at least 3 or 4 different academic institutions. And at the very top, you encounter ego, man. You encounter people who think this way. You'll have mentors that maybe won't be the best. And sometimes you'll luck out. You'll have great mentors, great professors. You'll have an amazing time. But then there are those people that don't, dude. And it's like, how do you feel about an academic institution who teaches these things as the status quo? Even if they're not fully right or there's still a place to go, this is still the status quo. This is still in textbooks, still in PowerPoint slides, still tested on curricula. And how do you parse that? I mean, my biggest question is, how do you parse that from the institutions that in some way have also some liturgical hierarchy, where there is a right question to the exam and there is a right way of doing things to certain people?
Yeah, so I would say that for most of like the intro level courses that you would take, most of the stuff that you'd be quizzed on in exams is going to be like pretty mainstream consensus. Like you're not going to be quizzed on like fringe stuff as if it's factual reality. I mean, maybe you had some really bad teachers, but I certainly was never quizzed about like, oh, like I know when we learned dark matter, we were not learning like this stuff exists, like this is what it's composed of. We were learning like here's the evidence from different sources that support and corroborate each other to suggest dark matter. Here's what we don't know about it currently. Like these things were straightforward. I agree with you that there are like, you know, academia is definitely not perfect. There's definitely big egos involved, but that feels like a massive leap to go from like acknowledging very valid criticisms of like the politics and the bureaucracy and like the you know, all the stuff that goes on in academia. And like there's certain obviously like trends and consensus, like string theory was in, now string theory is out. There's always like these trends of like including buzzwords in your grant proposals to get funding. Like I can acknowledge like there's flaws in academia. We could literally make it better and better. There's room for improvement for sure. But to then go from that to say this is akin to a religion, that's like way too much of a leap for me. Like to me, like, yes, I can acknowledge all those criticisms in the scientific consensus and the way that science and academia is done. First of all, I don't agree that there was ever a time where science was objective. I mean, maybe that's the goal of science. I mean, it's intersubjective, it's empirical, it's all these things. It still tries to be that. I would never say that science has ever been perfect in some golden era of history or whatever. I mean, we do the best that we can, right? I'm just trying to make the point, I guess, that a religion is not empirical. It's not the knowledge of a religion. The dogma of a religion is concrete. It doesn't change. It doesn't update if our data updates. It's not fact checking with empirical reality in the way that the scientific consensus is. So that's the big difference, I think, between the scientific consensus and why it's not akin to religious dogma.
See, the one thing I'll say with that is, well, one, I kind of idealize guys like Antoine Lavoisier and the cowboy Wild West days of science. Those are, I actually genuinely recommend looking into these early guys who were just rich dudes in their parents' basements.
Oh, wait, can we pause?
Wild experiments. Like,
I'm a big Lavoisier guy, so we can definitely find mutual agreement there. That guy's awesome. Like I definitely love amateur, like genteel scientist guys that are just doing this as like a labor of love and hobby. And Lavoisier had some awesome discoveries. He literally like paid for his own like really state-of-the-art lab that he then let like promising young amateur like scientists would promise like work in his lab and do research with him. And like his trial with the French Revolution, legendary, one of those, scientific martyr OG guys. So yeah, I agree that like, I love science history as well.
Yeah. And we can see quickly how like we always focus on these early days of science, right? Where there's like this element of persecution. I mean, Antoine Lavoisier got beheaded just because he was rich and French. So, I mean, that was a tough one.
I think the judge literally said that the French Revolution, right, has no need for scientists.
Yeah. Same guys who tried to recreate the calendar and failed. Couldn't mean that one into existence. So.
I think it's approaching the 15th of Brumaire.
Yeah. Yeah, that was tough, but all I'm doing is pointing out the fact that like just like discovering Pluto or these incidental acts of wonderful science, especially like the early fossil period where you had like random kids and cowboys and stuff finding Tyrannosaurus rexes and Triceratopses. One of the things I find incredible.
Stay tuned on my channel because my friend just found some fossils up in Wyoming. We're gonna go dig up some dinos here in a few months as soon as the snow melts and the mud dries. So exactly nice. What you just said is still happening to this very day. It's gonna be on my channel soon. So it's still going strong. The tradition is still going strong in the West. Okay, go out to Wyoming if you want to find some new dinos.
Yeah, and one thing I'll bring up is the fact that, I mean, paleontology is a really good example of this, where for a time, I mean, hell's sake, it was an objective hobby. It was fun. It's like, oh, I found a fossil. Oh, what is this? Is this like a new type of sapien? Oh, this is clearly an iguana. And so like people in Britain found fossils and everyone's like, well, heck, I'm just going to dig in the Badlands and see what I can find. Then we get the Morrison formation and we get the Day fossil bed.
That's where we're going to be digging, man. We're going to be literally unearthing dinos in the Morrison. So yeah, I still say paleontology is going just as strong. I mean, we're still making tons of really neat finds. Like there was literally just a whole dinosaur renaissance since the 90s. I mean, it's another one of those fields that continues to progress and our data continues to get richer and richer and richer with new finds.
Yeah, and one thing I'll mention though is like we all knew like the Othniel Charles Marsh and the Bone Wars and how all of that progressed. And what we saw in real time was a sudden shocking lack of objectivity in paleontology for a time. You started seeing paleontology and bone science, yeah. And but you saw what derivatives came from that. You saw how, oh, now we can use phrenology based on our archaeological finds to justify just like certain forms of esoteric racism in Central Europe. But you could see how something as cool as fossils could turn into something as heinous as phrenology. And a lot of this is because, okay, science isn't objective. Science is used in one way or another. And earlier I mentioned Michael Crichton in Jurassic Park, warning about the commercialization of genetics. Oh, you want to find out who you are and where you come from? Well, for $100, you can swab your cheek and I'll tell you who your grandmother is. And it's like, once you see that, I mean, like, yes, it's of course naturally assumed that science is not objective, especially in the modern day. There's an ends to a means. You don't go to college so you can just be a bum, right? Like you hopefully can either find a place in academia, a place in industry, and go about your life, But one thing I'll say here is like, once you involve money in politics, of course, you're not going to be objective. And one of the things that I say is like, I see how a lot of academia has crystallized. There can be a more objective way of doing things because I'm not convinced that true alternative ways of thinking using the same data that's just as sound, there's an element to that actually creates a lot of pushback. There's controversial takes that are valid and legitimate, but if they go against the status quo, there is a limit to what they will tolerate. Even if your data is valid.
I don't agree with that. If your data is valid, it will overturn the consensus. We have seen this time and time again recently, like with Mary Shelley.
Look how long it takes.
Like with Mary Shelley in paleontology, like, yes, like a scientist forms a career about it. Yes, it might be slow moving, but like it does update. This is why it's superior and why it is not a religion. And I find it like strange. You were talking about how earlier we need to go back to the objectivity of science in the golden era, but then you were freely admitting that, like, hey, at the very start of paleontology, like Marsh and Cope were the farthest from objective as possible. They were like dynamiting each other's boneyards just so the other one couldn't make the discoveries. I mean, I don't know when science was the most objective or whatever. It's just always a goal to try to keep being more objective. And I think the fact you're bringing up ways that paleontology used to be so much worse in the past than it is now, like, yes, there's still big egos involved in paleontology, but there's not dynamiting each other's finds. I mean, there's still like if you know paleontologists.
That's right, really, little Moroccan boy, dig me that Spinosaur.
I mean, they really care about fossils. You can definitely critique, like, especially like a lot of like decades ago, the treatment of indigenous people. I think paleontologists are getting way better with the way that they deal with like the native peoples, with their dig sites, with the way that they have ethics and the way they treat fossils. I think that they've made way progress since the Bone Wars.
Got these Moroccan kids out there singing "Wading in the Water," bro. It's tough.
Oh, come on. Not in this day and age, man. Not in this day and age. But I will say specifically, Morocco is tied with that image because the Moroccan government is one of the only governments that has like fully condoned the like industrialization of fossil hunting for profit. So that you literally have entire villages in Morocco whose entire livelihood is based on selling fossils for money. Like, so it's an industry in Morocco, and the government allows it, and it's one of the only governments on earth that does so. So it's like a political and legal situation specifically in Morocco. So that I mean that's what's a big factor there. But
yeah, do you want to hear an interesting?
My main point was I wanted to say I don't think atheism is a religion, and some of my favorite topics are abiogenesis and evolution. So I'm also down to talk about those.
Yeah, man. I think that I just think that when I've seen a specific narrative crafted about specific subjects that form a pretty cohesive line of thinking, and that's been funded, actively peddled, actively printed in books, actively taught and distributed in courses that are for profit, actively dealing with an institution that has a hierarchy, that has an established group of people that are trusted figures, that have ethos, that have established reputations, it very much mirrors religion. All I'm saying is that modern atheists have to ask themselves the question, has your conviction bordered on religious? That's all I'm saying. How convinced are you that a God doesn't exist? That's the core of atheism. Atheism is the belief that no God exists. It's a conviction. You are certain that there is no God or deities in this universe or beyond. That's the conviction of the atheist.
I disagree with that.
If you go outside that definition, you can say you're irreligious or agnostic. But an atheist is someone who's convinced that there is no God.
If we go to
if you disagree, we have to talk about definitions again. Because let's go right to Encyclopedia Britannica. We can go to
the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy, and we can go over like the two stances of atheism, of being a weak or strong atheist, and either just talking about atheism is either the lack of belief, or a stronger version of atheism is a positive belief that there are no gods. So personally, if you just want to ask me what I consider to be atheist versus agnostic, I think there is a meaningful distinction to be made between two types of people that answer this question two types of ways. If somebody asks you, hey, do you believe in God? And the first person says, I don't know, I'd say that's an agnostic. And if the second person says, no, I don't believe in God, I'd say that's an atheist. If the other person is really, really certain that no, they don't believe in God, like if you were to ask me, how much of my net worth would I put up, would I bet that there's no God? I'd say 100% of it. All my net worth, I would bet on that there's no God. Would you say, do I have a belief that there is no God? No. I just don't believe. I don't have a belief in the God. I don't have a positive belief that there is none. But I'm very, very certain. Like, I mean, not certain. I'm like 99.99 whatever. I'm not 100%. I think it's possible there's a God. But if I'm betting money, you know, I'm going all in, there's not. But I would still consider myself to be a weak atheist, or as some people like to belittle, a lack-theist.
A lack-theist. I like that, dude. Looks like there's someone else waiting. I'm going to respond, though. A lot of what I'm addressing is not to the typical everyday atheist. I want to hear what people believe, what people think. My experiences, your experiences, and the experiences of everybody is individualized. We've all had individual experiences. And therefore, using the allegory of self is insufficient to properly kind of discuss major topics that involve multiple individuals. That's a generalization. It's a fallacy. All I'm trying to do is get into the meat and bones of certain relevant parallels that I see, and also kind of tying in not only just my own experience, but an entire industry. That's a lot of what I'm addressing, bro. Is like,
so are you trying to say that that you think that atheism is a religion, but not all atheists are adherents to that religion? Like, are you saying that you don't think I'm a religious atheist, but you still think that atheism is a religion? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, it's as simple as this. What is your conviction that there is no God? You have your ways of explaining the universe, and you've shown me that you believe there's validity to the Big Bang. All I'm saying is, if we're talking about these subjects from a purely scientific perspective, there are scientific rebukes to these. These are not watertight phenomena. Abiogenesis, macroevolution, and the Big Bang, there are elements of it that are unknown. There are elements of it that have to be called into question about the actual processes by which this entire process is set to come about.
First of all,
until these questions, of course, we're building a narrative to figure these things out, but we can't deny the millions and millions of dollars spent on everything in this educational institution based around a secular mindset. We have to admit that this secular mindset has come upon a certain consensus. You can push the boundaries, further your field, but if you step too far out of line in terms of how you perceive the universe, perceive reality from these constraints, you will find a huge amount of pushback. That's all I've been saying, is that there are certain institutional aspects of modern secular thought, whether you want to call it atheist thought, anything that doesn't involve God and stands as a contrary alternative ideology thereof, has started to mimic something religious to me. When you see this entire thing come out of pop science, when you see people grifting, showing up to talk shows, selling you their books, showing up on all kinds of programs, that's what happens, man. It's like there is the sense that atheism has become crystallized into a more cohesive ideology than what people are trying to talk about.
You made so many points. Let me try to remember them all. Okay. First of all, I definitely would not group evolution together with the Big Bang and abiogenesis as being on equal footing. Like, abiogenesis is not even a theory. Evolution is very, very well supported. Like, it's basically a fact at this point. We can talk about any of that if you want, but I don't know. We'll see. You asked me about what basis I have to not believe in God. And since we already talked about Lavoisier and the French Revolution, I might go back to that time period again and quote Laplace. I have no need for that hypothesis. And, you know, essentially, even if I didn't have any of modern science, I still think that I would have sufficient grounds for not believing in God based on the lack of evidence or reason to do so. There were plenty of atheists way before science, from, you know, ancient Iron Age India and Greece and Rome. There have been atheists long before there was any sort of scientific method like systematically employed. And then can you remind me about the final point that you ended off with there about I think that you were just gesturing. You're saying that you still see these parallels that you find between modern, and I think that there's like this conflation. Maybe you can differentiate between like scientific academia and atheism, which I would say are two different things. Like, a lot of the big egos that you're talking about in these fields that you're critiquing about in science they're theists. A lot of them, like, they're not all atheists. I mean, they're just scientists. So it's like, are you saying that science is a religion? If you're not, then why is it specifically atheism as a religion if it relies on the scientific consensus of things like the Big Bang or evolution or abiogenesis, which, like, by the way, like, we literally don't even have a theory of abiogenesis. Like, how can we rely on it if there's literally no proposed mechanism even?
Yeah. So in order to address this, I will simply go back to the philosophical. Quite simply speaking, you talk about, of course, like, oh, well, these people are theists, science, etc. Most of what we perceive from these aspects, the reason I've ascribed this to atheism in the first place, people have said it's a straw man, whatever, I can live with that. The reason I ascribe it to this is because I find it difficult to divorce the modern atheist from these concepts. Time after time after time, I wonder and think to myself, the entire reason I even made this video is because I talked to some of my friends who are atheists. And what I realized talking with them for a time is that I slowly came to realize that the same talking points were used over and over again. To address the meat and bones, dude.
Weren't you just saying
science,
you can't rely on
science
life
is not
or life experience?
Science, what I've grown to realize is that science is the primary method through which the modern atheist sees the world and justifies it. When you find your conviction, why don't you believe in God? That backing is on science, right?
No, it's not on science. It's really not. It's the fact that I don't have any sufficient reason to believe in God. Like, science is nice in that, and here's the reason why atheists tend to embrace science. Not all atheists. I don't know. Maybe this is, again, you said earlier that we shouldn't rely on personal experiences or whatever. Again, I've met a lot of atheists that are into all kinds of hoodoo, voodoo, reject the Big Bang, and, you know, there's flat earth atheists. There's some really wackadoos out there, all kinds of different atheistic beliefs. I mean, there's Shinto atheists, Buddhist atheists, all kinds of different atheists out there. And the reason why that, at least in the West, maybe at least in the YouTube atheist internet debatosphere, so many atheists embrace science is because it's widely acknowledged to be the most reliable method for, like, discovering empirical truths about the world around us, because it's provisional and it updates when we get better and better, more refined data. I mean, isn't that obvious? Shouldn't you also accept that? I mean, what grounds do you have, like, for saying that there's a better method for finding truths about the world?
All I'm going to say is this. When I get a solidified foundation for what I understand and it's based off the scientific method, if I'm then given mathematical principles and theorems and given a nice trust me bro label, even though we know for a fact that this is all a work in progress, I mean, of course you have to go with what's most recent and updated. We trust the science. But as we've seen, when you have the corruption of science by money, when you have specific narratives that you want to push, certain people in charge, this is what I mean by ego. This is what I mean by a message. I've been doing a whole series on climate change and seeing how, you know, different actors, different funders affect different ways people talk about this subject. Just like we discussed earlier, is modern science really objective? So of course I'm not calling science a religion. Science is objective to the point where you can use it any way you want, except when we get into the realm of pure conjecture. Except when we get into the realm of this is the perspective we're going to teach the universe as a materialist construct that randomly assembled itself out of nothing. You're not just going to have the Big Bang not paired with abiogenesis. In fact, whenever I heard about abiogenesis presented, it was presented always as a multiplicity. We now have LUCA. We now have the self-assembling rhizome engulfed in a phospholipid bilayer bubble. We have different ways of interpreting and probably postulating how life came about, but always from an abiogenic perspective. When I talked about stepping outside of the box, dude, what I meant was presenting a fundamentally different perspective to explain the same phenomenon with perfectly coherent data. You say that this would be embraced and accepted in academia, yet many of these people are labeled as pariahs for decades, if not centuries after they make something groundbreaking in science. It's happened forever. The only difference now is that we've now consolidated all of these thoughts, consolidated all of these ways of teaching the universe into an academic curriculum. It's a rigid curriculum that you are tested on, and it produces the same results, the same people with the same mindset, telling other people with their millions of subscribers or their hundreds of thousands of daily channel viewers or whoever the hell reads their books this specific line of thinking. All I'm saying is, when you start getting this universally dictated, we can believe in the free-thinking atheist all we want. Individually, I bet this is the case, and there are many, many atheists that still, like I mentioned in the beginning, consistently try to rework and reformulate what they believe. But I am not talking about the individual atheist. I'm trying very, very hard, using this platform, using this discussion, to try to pick the brain of what atheists believe now and how this institution has affected the way that atheists think. I'm not here to cast any shade on science or academia. I'm not even here to cast shade on atheism. I'm just here to get people to think objectively about how much they vociferously defend an ideology when they're just looking at shadows on a wall, trying to step outside the box and think about ways, how could this universe come about? How could life come about? How could these fundamental questions be answered without this specific perspective? And that's the trap everyone falls into, man. That's all I've been saying this whole time.
Okay, so I think honestly, like the reason why like I'm interested in these kinds of discussions, and especially when somebody comes out with a statement like atheism is a religion, and you claim like you're not attacking it or whatever, but it is a bold claim, you admit. The reason why I come out and have this discussion is because I am interested in truth, right? I want my views to be as accurately aligned as I possibly can have them with the actual empirically verifiable reality around me. The reason why, again, abiogenesis, not a theory, you were kind of touching on it. It's a series of different competing hypotheses, a bunch of different ideas. None of them are complete. None of them are consensus. None of them are a theory. They're still at the level of hypotheses, and they're competing. There is no singular explanation for abiogenesis. The reason why we don't then conclude that, well, this gap in science is probably more likely to be supernatural or some deity or intelligent design or something, I would posit, is because in the history of science, we've seen that over time we had maximally supernatural explanations for phenomena in the past. Everything from lightning to diseases to rainbows, everything was explained with some supernatural phenomenon. And if we just look at the track record of history, at there's a decreasing share of verified explanations, or like I just should say of explanations for phenomenon that are supernatural. It's more and more verified to be naturalistic causes for phenomenon that used to be attributed to supernatural deities. And so if we just look at, hey, if we're using past history to make decisions about what's more probable, then we should say, based on all the track record of success for scientific naturalistic explanations in the past, it's more likely to be that eventually we will have a naturalistic theory of abiogenesis. Because we know something had to start the process. It's just right now we don't know what it was. So it's just looking what seems more likely based on the evidence we have right now.
Cool. And I don't want to be cringe and say you fell into my trap card, because this is now my sort of ballpark.
You've activated my trap card.
Yeah. All I say is, and this is something I actually talked about because it is a hypothesis. It's an if-then statement, where if the conditions of early Earth were sufficient to create life, then life would emerge. That's the basic hypothesis.
Sure.
In a nutshell. It's an if-then statement, like all hypotheses.
I agree.
The issue is that, like, when I clearly pointed out that this is contrary to Louis Pasteur, boiled flask experiments, spontaneous generation has already been disproven by science for ages, and yet still, even when this is brought up, tens of millions of dollars have been pumped into this, and it's been taught in biology textbooks since time immemorial, at least somewhere, even as a passing paragraph.
So I would,
and at that point, man, you have to admit that there is some level of dogmatics in academia. If they can't get on, if they can't come to terms on what a species is, if they can't stop the contrarian BS and just get over themselves a little bit, things would get better. But there's also this fundamental strain of getting over decades of established dogma that you've poured tons of money into. There is this momentum in academia where you have to kind of fight between the lines. You got to get in the ring.
Look,
you cannot go outside the ring. This is not WWE, bro. This is boxing. Look, you got to.
I think you're totally 100% backwards on this. In academia, there is an incentive. scientists literally make their entire careers off of overturning the consensus. If you have the evidence and the data to back you, you can literally turn your entire career into a success by overturning the consensus and going up against.
Where's my Nobel Prize? Where's my Nobel Prize?
I don't know, dude. Where is it? If you don't, maybe your evidence is insufficient. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you need to go back to the drawing board on it. I don't know.
Louis Pasteur? I'm gonna go to that museum.
Let me address
right now.
Let me
I'm
address
gonna go to that boiled flask right now, bro. It has all kinds of amino acids and RNA fragments.
Allow me
right now, bro.
Allow me to address Louis Pasteur. I want to differentiate between spontaneous generation, which is what Louis Pasteur disproved, and abiogenesis, because I agree with you that if the conditions for early life were, amenable for abiogenesis, then life arises. In Louis Pasteur's experiment, were the conditions sufficient for prebiotic Earth? No, of course not. He did not replicate anything about early life's conditions. So obviously that's not going to be a good example for like an abiogenesis experiment. If that's
what about 50 years? What about 50 years of trying?
The hypothesis that he was overturning, right? The hypothesis that he was overturning was specifically that things like flies and larvae and maggots could just pop into existence like overnight, like spontaneously. Like that is not at all what abiogenesis is saying. Abiogenesis starts with self-replicating molecular systems. That's not a fly. That's not a maggot. That's like totally different than what Louis Pasteur disproved. It's a separate thing. You're trying to conflate the two.
So this is what Louis Pasteur proved. He took 2 flasks, filled them with chicken broth from the same stock.
Mm-hmm.
He had a control that he left sealed on its own, whatever. He then had another flask, one with a crooked tube, the other without. After a time, both were left out, and then both were sealed. So there we go. In one flask, it spoiled because its neck was straight. Spores came in and contaminated it. It was rotten, disgusting. Microbes flourished inside of it. It's a perfect ecosystem for growing microbes. The boiled flask, however, the other one with the crooked neck, not a single spore, not a single microbe. And to this day, still not a single microbe.
Right.
It's a perfect nutrient soup. Every vitamin, mineral, amino acid, nucleotide, anything these cells need.
Let me ask you, do you think...
And in perfect laboratory conditions since mid-70s,
okay,
we have been trying to create life in a lab.
Let me just ask
amino acids, phospholipid bilayers, but no matter what we try, we cannot create life synthetically.
Let me just ask.
It's been a massive hole in this theory that has continued to suck money from academia. That's all I'm saying. It's been disproven for years.
Just ask you. Yeah. Do you think that the early prebiotic Earth was composed of chicken broth?
No, I think it's composed of dilute seawater.
Right.
Oh, it's an even worse condition for life. Awesome.
So then it would obviously be that Louis Pasteur's condition of just starting with chicken broth would not be in any way close to approximating early Earth conditions, like at all. So it would not then be a good experiment to test abiogenesis, would it?
No, decades of further experimentation would. And
so now you're arriving at a more justifiable critique than you originally started with Louis Pasteur, which you should have just started with saying it's been a long, long time of abiogenesis research. Why haven't scientists had results of creating life in a lab? And it all goes back to your traditional if-then statement. You said, if there were sufficient conditions for abiogenesis on the early Earth, then abiogenesis would occur. So then the question would be put forward, do we know the right conditions for abiogenesis on an early Earth? And the answer is no. We're doing as much as we can to approximate what those conditions are and figure out what those conditions are. But so far, we don't know those conditions. So, we haven't hit upon those conditions yet. That's why we haven't done it yet. Seems pretty straightforward to me. There's lots of areas of science where we have had much, much, much more work done on it than abiogenesis, and we still haven't figured it out for things that you would think should be trivial. There's tons of question marks in science that we've worked on for hundreds of years to no avail, and we're still working on them, I mean, we're not going to stop working on them just because it's a difficult question. Doesn't mean we just have to say, well, I guess there just isn't a scientific naturalistic explanation for it. Like, that's not how science works.
Yeah. Could I ask you one follow-up question, like one last
Sure.
follow-up question before I move on to Roboto? The one thing I'll say about this is, do you then think it's worth decades of research and the millions spent to try to disprove one of the grandfathers of biology?
Again, Louis Pasteur is not like the opposing camp to abiogenesis. I really disagree with you conflating spontaneous generation with abiogenesis, which I think are two totally different hypotheses. Not at all to be conflated. Louis Pasteur was an opponent to spontaneous generation. He was not an opponent to abiogenesis in what we mean by abiogenesis as today. Not just, oh, hey, a living species just spontaneously emerged in a couple of hours from some chicken broth. That is silly to try to conflate that with abiogenesis. So I would appreciate it if you would just stop doing that, because I think you know it's wrong too. I think you know that it's not an accurate, like, it's a straw man. Like, come on.
So spontaneous, so life emerging out of nowhere in seawater is somehow not comparable to life randomly assembling itself out of chicken broth, even though the entire thesis of Louis Pasteur at the end of the day was what?
So
only life can beget life, my dude.
You're
trying to explain to me that life can randomly assemble itself when the grandfather of microbiology came out with one of those groundbreaking and longest running experiments that proves that only life can beget life. We have to answer the chicken or the egg. This existential chicken or the egg cannot be answered with abiogenesis. It's just facts, bro. We've tried for decades to solve this question without any avail. So this
again,
is kind of what I've been saying.
Apply the same logic to any other area of science where we've tried for much, much, much longer than abiogenesis, and we have much better data. Like you said that you were majored in physics, right? I often bring up the Mpemba effect, which is where, like, if you have two like bottles of water, and one of them used to be at a hotter temperature, but now they're at the same temperature, the one that used to be at a hotter temperature will freeze quicker if you freeze them both, and nobody knows why. It's a mystery in physics, and it's been a mystery for 2,000 years. They've been trying to work on this problem, and it seems like, oh, it should be some easy thing. It's just about freezing water. We've understood that forever, but we still to this day don't understand it. And it's like, are you just going to say, oh, well, you know what? It must just be God who's freezing that water faster? Because obviously we've been trying for thousands of years, and all of the scientists, for all the billions of dollars we've spent on physics, they still can't understand about water freezing. Well, it must be that every time that previous water that used to be hot freezes faster, that is a miraculous intervention by God. You would not say that, I don't think. So then why is it that, oh, now over here, with the same exact logic I just went through with the Mpemba effect, you're now trying to say, oh, well, for life to be created, we know that it has to be, like, it can't be this naturalistic explanation, and we just throw away abiogenesis, which, by the way, again, Louis Pasteur would not agree with the way you're characterizing his position. Stop conflating spontaneous generation, which is like current species arising out of just broth, right? That is not at all abiogenesis. That's a straw man of abiogenesis. I hope your viewers know when you describe it that way.
Can beget life is a straw man. You
are being so overly reductionistic to say, oh, well, it's just in seawater. Like, no, that is so insufficient and ambiguous to be like disingenuous, basically. That is so, like, you cannot.
Is it disingenuous to say that 50 years of further research trying to disprove Louis Pasteur has come up with nothing but a few amino acids and a phospholipid bilayer?
It absolutely is disingenuous to make that statement, yes, because abiogenesis research is not trying to disprove Louis Pasteur, and we have had many, many more innovations than what you just said. Like ribozymes were predicted specifically from the the progenitor of the RNA world hypothesis, who said, hey, if this hypothesis is correct, then we should expect to see RNA that could also act as enzymes. Then we found ribozymes. We have been making progress in our understandings of, like, the dynamics of amyloids that I talk about on my channel. We've been making progress about, like, what can catalyze prebiotic reactions. how even inorganic molecules can adopt like self-replicating behaviors and can have enzymatic activities. Like there's a lot of discoveries that have come out of this field. And like for you to characterize it as just, oh, it's just saying it happened in seawater and we didn't learn anything other than phospholipid bilayers. It's like, dude, that is disingenuous what you're saying. I mean, learn more about the science if you're going to try to criticize it. That's all I got to say.
Science has not come out with life. You can give me as many, oh, this chemical came about. Dude, you have to create a coherent, self-replicating organism that's capable of anabolism and metabolism.
Okay,
and this is literally creating a fully fledged, independent, self-sustaining organism, not some ribosomal viroid, not some proto self-replicating enzyme, dude. You're stepping in a right direction. The direction's life or not life. It's a binary.
So I think
you've been trying to say that life can randomly self-assemble from literally just inert particles and matter, to say that it's disingenuous to conflate that with what Louis Pasteur was literally testing, which is life assembling itself from inert basic pieces of organic matter, that's where I have a problem. And when you've tested this relentlessly for over 50 years and spent millions of dollars, and you still have, okay, cool, you have enzymes, you have certain ribozymes, cool. You don't have life. You've been trying to disprove one of the longest running successful experiments and saying that it's not spontaneous generation when you were having inanimate particles turning into animate life.
Totally different.
How does that happen, dude?
Because here's the thing.
There's either a state where it's not alive and a state that it is. Or are you going to say that, it's like, I don't understand this, dude. You're saying that life is randomly self-assembled.
Because
that's what you've been trying to prove with no avail for 50 years.
Because you're being way too general. When you say, oh, non-living matter to life, what spontaneous generation means by life and what abiogenesis means by life are way, totally, completely, not at all, cannot be conflated, different things. And that is your error. You just keep saying, oh, it's life.
So you want to redefine what life is?
Sure, yeah.
In good faith, you're going to redefine what life is?
Yes, I will. Let me do it. I'll do it if you stop talking. Okay, I will just go with NASA's definition of life, which you might disagree with, but that's fine because you reject evolution. But NASA's definition of life is just organic material capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution over time, independently. So that would be life. So basically, and that is for exoplanets and abiogenesis. That's what NASA uses as a short offhand. There's not any clear consensus in science about what life is, but I'm getting distracted. The main point, right, is that you're conflating these two things. Spontaneous generation, life, a full-formed, currently modern species. Abiogenesis means by life is just a self-replicating molecular system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution, which you reject evolution. So this is why we just have, we don't even have a starting basis to talk about this, because I say that the big stride would be to create a self-replicating molecular system that can arise spontaneously with prebiotic conditions and is capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. You would say, but you didn't even create life then, because even then I don't believe that could evolve into life, even though it's evolving under Darwinian conditions, because you reject macroevolution entirely. So it's like, yeah, you would reject it then. My question for you, my last question, is that if we did, some scientist, some genius scientist in a lab did exactly what we were talking about, what up to your standards, whatever those are, and in a lab with prebiotic conditions created life up to your liking, so you would say, yeah, okay, they created life. What then? Would you just say, this just proves that it requires intelligent design, or would you just move the goalpost, or how would you react to that? Would you change anything about your position? Is this really a side topic to your actual worldview?
Yeah. So the final question I would ask, and this is the point where, again, I've reiterated these points before in earlier streams, but when the argument is about life coming from not life, or life coming from material, from inert matter, we have to discuss and be honest with ourselves about what it takes to create life as we know it. We have to start with, you say that, it's a self-replicating viroid using ribozymes, and then the ribosomes came, the rRNA folded itself. That also could emerge over time. And the issue is that there's a certain irreducible complexity with the basic organism that we see, even the most basic organisms on the planet Earth. And one of the reasons that we know this is a problem for two reasons. One is one of the key things that supports the idea of abiogenesis at its face. One, that life seems to be built on a basic fundamental template. Now, this is interesting. This is what's caused LUCA. This is what's caused all these things to emerge. There aren't multiple strains or lineages of life that have emerged this way. That's one of the biggest issues that I have. And you could say, oh, well, at one time, maybe life could have done this in genetic drift and all this. But one of the biggest fundamental issues I have is the actual astronomical improbability of most of these chemical processes you're describing actually resulting in a coherent organism. If you actually address that, life emerged just 450 million years at its earliest, only 500,000 years at its latest, after the consolidation of the oceans. That process, if it was built by random enzymes, ribozymes, particles self-replicating, it should have taken billions of years.
You have no basis to make that claim.
My basis is 50 years of research that have been wholly unable to actually come through these processes without deliberate manipulation. You're having to shock it with electricity and add all these other impulses to it. And quite frankly, I'm not impressed. One of the reasons I've arrived at this position is because we've spent millions of dollars blowing our money on experiments that are continually proving that this guy is right. You're trying to go against basic established biology, saying that it's a false comparison to spontaneous generation, but literally trying to say life came from nowhere.
Okay.
Even a fundamental Darwinian organism, you're trying to claim something that has not been proven by observable, testable, and replicable data. And for the record, the reason I disagree with macroevolution is based on the same principles, all about timescales, all about models that disprove the basic thing these people are saying for profit.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I know you're saying a lot. I'm just trying to address the thing that you were saying 10 things ago, which was, oh man, I'm trying to keep it all in my head. Maybe I got to start taking notes when you start talking, because you're making 5 points at once. You were talking about, you said, when I asked you what your basis was, you were saying that your basis was that they've been unsuccessful for 50 plus years and they've spent millions of dollars, even though, by the way, just for your knowledge, origin of life research is like one of the most underfunded areas of science, period. It's really poorly funded. But I'll put that aside for now. There have been millions, like multiple millions, so we can agree with that. It's just that small potatoes compared to other fields of science. But sure, 50 plus years, millions of dollars. But you're saying that based on that, you're using that as your basis to conclude then that life couldn't have happened naturalistically, spontaneously over 450 to 500 million years, and it would therefore have to be over 1 billion years. That basis is insufficient to justify that claim. There's no connection between those things, my guy. That's not a good, valid basis for you to make the conclusions you're making.
Okay. Yeah, dude. And I appreciate you coming on too. This was a nice talk. I hope your future subs like the content. And yeah, I think it's good that we're asking these questions. One of the reasons I started this stream is so we can get down to the meat and bones of these things. Because you have a wide breadth and depth of these subjects, and a lot of people don't. People have a difference in how they were educated, their fields that they specified in. And one of the things that I've always critiqued on this channel is the lack of interdisciplinary communication of concepts and clarification. I like the fact that you presented your data. I like the fact that you were coherent and represented your points well and without excessive emotion. You didn't rely on ad hominem. You didn't give me a bunch of really crappy whatever ideological pitfalls, fallacies, whatever you want to call them. And you were respectful the whole time. So you know what? I was really skeptical about bringing people on and adding stream keys, but I'm glad that you came on. I guess I can go more into this topic. I just advise people watch the stream I did on it, I guess. You can disagree then too. But I do appreciate having you on, Grayson. Thank you, bro.
Cool. Hey, well, thanks for having me on, Vince. I appreciated talking with you. It was a great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good one.
And hey, wait, I just want to say, atheism, not a religion. Peace.
Okay, cool.